So now let's explore components in more detail by having a look at the broadcast message function. Now off screen I've edited the enemy class, so the enemy class applies to all of these red cubes, and I've added a new function to that class. Let me just show you that in MonoDevelop. Here is the enemy class, and I've added public void hide. I've added the hide function which prints to the console enemy hides, and it uses GameObject.setActive to false to hide the object in the scene. Now what I want to do here by minimizing MonoDevelop, when I press the spacebar on the keyboard, I want all of these enemy objects to hide, to just change their state from visible to non-visible. Now there are many different ways that I can do this, and one way is to loop through all of the enemy objects in the scene and call the hide function. And in fact I've already coded the Game Manager class to do this. Let me just open up the Game Manager class, which is over here. You will notice in the update function, when I press the spacebar key on the keyboard, it loops through all of the enemies in the enemy array that we have populated here. It loops through all of the enemies and calls the hide function. So I'm just going to minimize MonoDevelop and press play on the toolbar here. And now when I press spacebar on the keyboard, all of the enemy objects in the scene disappear. Now this is one way we can go about implementing this behavior, but there is another and perhaps more efficient method that can be achieved using the broadcast message function. So let's see how that works. Now in short, the broadcast message function allows us to pick a game object in the scene and specify the name of a function. Unity will then loop through all the components attached to the game object. If the component has a function with a matching name, it runs that function. If the component doesn't have a function with the matching name, then Unity just goes ahead and ignores that component. And then what it does is it loops through all of the child objects and repeats that process for all of them as well. And we can take advantage of this kind of behavior to really easily just hide all the objects in the scene. So let me show you how we're going to go ahead and do that. The first thing I'm going to do is to create a completely new game object in the scene. So I'm going to choose game object create empty, and I'm just going to position it at the origin. It doesn't really matter where in the level we position it, but I'm going to position it straight away at the origin here. So I'm going to highlight all of these values and just set them to 0. So now we've positioned the game object at the origin. I'm going to name the game object enemies, like so, and I'm going to select all of our enemy objects and just drag and drop them underneath the enemies object. So now we have the enemies object, and it has all of these child objects, which are the enemy cubes. So all of these enemy cubes now have been parented to the enemies object. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to return to MonoDevelop here, and I'm going to be editing the update function of the Game Manager. Right now we loop through all of the enemy objects in the enemy array and called the hide function for each of them. But now we're going to be using broadcast message. So the first thing I'm going to do is just completely delete this for loop here. So I'm going to delete this from the code. And I'm going to type game object dot find, and what I'm going to find is the game object named enemies. So the enemies object, if I minimize MonoDevelop, the enemies object is this top node here that contains all of our child objects, all of these red cubes. So I'm going to jump back to MonoDevelop. So we're going to be finding that game object, and for that game object we're going to be calling the function broadcast message. And what I want to do with the broadcast message is I want to call the function hide, which is the function, if I switch over to the enemies class, it is the function that I have coded here, hide. So I'm going to switch back to Game Manager. So we're going to find the enemies object, and we want to call the broadcast message function and specify the function hide. And I'm going to specify the parameter here, send message options don't require a receiver. What that does is it ensures that we will not get an error if one of the components on the object does not contain a hide function. If I minimize MonoDevelop, you will see that these enemy objects here they have many different components, a transform component, a box collider, a mesh renderer, and these all kinds of other components. Some of these components will not contain a hide function, and so we do not want to get an error if they do not support the hide function. So I'm going to return back to MonoDevelop and leave this statement as is now, and I'm going to press Ctrl S on the keyboard to save those changes and just minimize MonoDevelop, and we're going to press play on the toolbar, and now when I press the spacebar on the keyboard, all of these objects in the scene hide just as they did before, except this time we do not need to have a loop or any kind of multiple lines. We can just use one statement there and completely hide all of the objects, because if I just bring back MonoDevelop, this broadcast message function acts recursively. It cycles through all the child objects and calls the hide function. If a game object has more than one component and all of those components have a hide function, then all of them will be called. So this is really a great way, a really quick way in which we can call a function on many different objects at the same time.